Welcome to the ultimate camera comparison between the iPhone 13 Pro and the Pixel 6 Pro. Let's get started. And to get things underway, let's take a look at how each phone captures video. With both phones, when you use the main lens, you can shoot at a 4K resolution with a frame rate of up to 60 frames per second. With the iPhone 13 Pro, that remains the case no matter what lens you're shooting with. Be it the ultra-wide, the 3x telephoto, or even the selfie camera, 4K 60 is consistent across the board. Not so with the Pixel 6 Pro. If you want to switch to any of the other lenses for video, you've got to dive into the settings and manually switch the frame rate down to 30 frames a second. That said, with previous Pixel devices, anytime you switched to filming with the selfie camera, the resolution was automatically capped at a max of 1080p. Thankfully, this year, Google finally lets us shoot at a 4K resolution when using the selfie camera, which sees a much needed jump in video quality when shooting with the selfie lens. But aside from resolutions and frame rates, image quality is also pretty different when shooting videos with each of these phones. So the first thing that jumped out to me was that videos captured on the Pixel 6 Pro look a lot more saturated and vibrant compared to those captured on the iPhone 13 Pro. They're also quite a bit more contrasty thanks to the impressive HDR performance of the iPhone 13 Pro. And in general, the Pixel 6 Pro's darker areas of the video are a lot darker and the dynamic range is worse overall. Though I will say the difference is not nearly as stark as it was with last year's devices. There are some small instances where the Pixel 6 Pro manages to retain highlights better than the iPhone 13 Pro, like here where I'm walking out of this tunnel. But overall, in terms of general image quality, the iPhone 13 Pro is the clear winner. When it comes to audio, rather than hearing my opinion on the matter, you can let your ears do the talking as I use each of the different cameras on these phones to thank today's video sponsor, Rhino Shield. Oh, and just for reference, all of the B-roll shots throughout this Rhino Shield segment will also be shot on either the iPhone 13 Pro or the Pixel 6 Pro. There'll be a little icon down the bottom somewhere that will indicate what phone and lens you're currently watching and listening to. And if you're wondering why I'm not using the telephoto lenses in this comparison, well, otherwise the audio would sound like this. So starting with the main lenses on these two phones, and firstly, I do want to say a huge thank you to Rhino Shield as they've put their hands up to sponsor several videos on the channel this year, which is seriously incredible. But as you guys know, I don't just partner up with any random brands. I always want to ensure the products I'm promoting are ones I'm really confident in, and that's what I love about Rhino Shield and why I continue to work with them, because put simply, all of their cases are top tier. Okay, onto the ultra-wide lenses. Rhino Shield makes cases for a huge collection of phones, including of course the Pixel 6 and iPhone 13 lineup, and they all come in a huge variety of finishes and styles. Plus, they've done a bunch of big name collaborations as well, including with Keith Haring, the creators of Snoopy, and also some great independent artists like Jake Parker and Lim Heng Sui, as well as a stack more. And you can even dial in your own customizations on their website if you want to make your phone feel a little more you. And now onto the selfie cameras. Not only do their cases look really cool, but they're also highly protective as well. And if you pick up one of their impact screen protectors to go with, I mean, you're pretty much guaranteed to keep your phone in pristine condition. Oh, and did I mention that all of their cases come with a lifetime warranty? Rhino Shield also offers free shipping for qualified orders, and right now during their Black Friday promotions, you can get up to 60% off site-wide. And if you use my code SAMPRO during this period, you can get an additional 10% off on top of that. Don't worry, if you're watching this video after that time period, then you can still get a handy 10% off if you use my code. So make sure that you check out all of their amazing cases and consider picking one up for your own phone using the first link down in the description below. Now, in terms of low light video, last year, the Pixel 5 really struggled with capturing videos in less than optimal conditions, with videos becoming this mushy, pretty awful mess. But this year, thanks to those bigger sensors on the Pixel 6 Pro, low light video is a lot nicer. It's still quite grainy, much more so compared to the fairly clean low light videos captured on the iPhone 13 Pro, but the grain is a much nicer quality of grain, meaning the image still looks fairly sharp, and for the most part, I'd say the low light videos are somewhat usable. The stabilization on the Pixel does take a pretty big hit in these sorts of conditions though, with more artifacts and jello visible compared to the iPhone 13 Pro. And so despite the improvements made when shooting low light video with the Pixel 6 Pro, somehow the results are still a lot nicer and cleaner from the iPhone 13 Pro, despite its cameras having smaller sensors. Now, speaking of stabilization, both phones have your standard OIS, although the iPhone has sensor shift OIS, whereas the Pixel is using your more run-of-the-mill lens OIS. But regardless of what stabilization technology either phone is using, what I will say is that the iPhone's stabilization is much more natural looking, with little to no artifacts evident at all. On the other hand, the Pixel stabilization looks a little more jittery and wobbly in comparison, although admittedly, this is really only evident if you're really pixel peeping, but it's still something to keep in mind. As with last year's Pixel devices though, we still have those additional stabilization modes on the Pixel 6 Pro, and for anyone who's forgotten what they are, we have active, cinematic pan, and locked. In active mode, I'd say the Pixel 6 Pro's stabilization matches the natural looking stabilization of the iPhone 13 Pros. However, it forces you to drop down to 1080p, and there is a fairly decent crop in as well, and that means the final result looks far worse than with the setting off. I'd probably recommend never turning this one on. Cinematic pan seems to me like Google just takes that raw 4K 60 video and slows it down to 50%, but straight out of the camera. You can see I've lined it up with the same shot taken on the iPhone 13 Pro that I've manually slowed to 50% using my editing software, and the results are fairly similar. In fact, strike that, the speed is similar, but the quality from the Pixel is worse. Not only are there more shakes and wobbles evident in the Pixel 6 Pro's footage, but Google also disables audio recording whenever you use this mode with no way to bring it back whatsoever. So I really can't see a great use for this mode as well. Now, the last stabilization mode is locked, and this is where Google uses software trickery to essentially emulate having your phone on a tripod. You can see the side-by-side here with the iPhone 13 Pro's footage, which has that pretty standard level of handheld movement, whereas the Pixel 6 Pro's footage has essentially none. Yet the issue is when you're shooting with this mode on Pixel devices, you actually end up introducing this very slight jittery artifact into the footage, which is inevitable when applying that amount of stabilization onto a video that was shot handheld. It's not like the iPhone's footage is super shaky either. Yes, there's handheld motion, but it's fairly fluid and smooth, and to be frank, it's more pleasing compared to that jitteriness from the Pixel 6 Pro. So up to this point, things are looking fairly grim for the Pixel 6 Pro when it comes to capturing video, and I haven't even mentioned cinematic mode. So cinematic mode is a new feature that comes with the iPhone 13 lineup, and it's basically portrait mode but for videos. Other phones have had a similar feature for a while, though the Pixel 6 Pro has no such feature. But whilst it's not flawless with the iPhone 13 Pro, it's still by far the best in terms of the results it yields. Yes, it might look a bit artificial, and it does cap the resolution to 1080p, but the edge detection doesn't flicker at all once you hit record. And to be honest, I can see this being a pretty enticing feature for those looking to get into vlogging, for example. So a bit of a blowout so far for the iPhone 13 Pro, but there is one area in regards to video capturing where the Pixel 6 Pro does take the crown, and that is changing lenses mid-recording. So I don't know if this is a bug with the iPhone lineup or what, but once you hit that record button, the iPhone 13 Pro will not let you switch lenses. But even with that being the case, you still get the 0.5, 1x, and 3x toggles on the screen, which is really confusing. So let's take this recording for example, which I started on both phones with their respective ultra-wide lenses. No worries. But then when I hit that 1x button, whilst you can see that the Pixel 6 Pro switches to the main lens fairly quickly, the iPhone 13 Pro just zooms in digitally, resulting in pretty poor image quality. And then when I tap the telephoto lens option, again, the Pixel 6 Pro switches over to that 4x lens automatically, albeit with a slight delay, but the iPhone 13 Pro just digitally zooms in again. And even though we had the 3x button visible, it actually caps us to a 1.5x zoom. But again, all of this is just digitally zooming in from the ultra wide lens, which means the end result looks atrocious. I've got to say, the fact that I need to stop and start recording every time I want to change lenses on the iPhone 13 Pro is really annoying. And I hope it's just a bug that Apple will address in the future, but I'm not holding my breath. All right, finally, in regards to video, let's talk how the phones compare in regards to zoomed in shots. So whilst the iPhone 13 Pro caps out at a max digital zoom of 9x, the Pixel 6 Pro lets us go all the way to 20x, resulting in a much closer shot. And whilst the artifacts are of course going to be enlarged and therefore more visible when at this range, I'd still say the results are pretty on par with the 9x shot taken on the iPhone 13 Pro. But then when we jump back to a 9x digital zoom on the Pixel 6 Pro, the result is a lot cleaner. Just look at those electrical wires. They are much sharper in the Pixel 6's video, and so if you're in that sector of people who know they'll be shooting lots of telephoto videos, the Pixel 6 Pro actually takes the crown. I do also want to quickly mention the performance of these phones when shooting videos, and it's worth noting that most of these video samples were shot right in the middle of the day when the sun was beaming down at its brightest. And whilst the Pixel 6 Pro certainly got a little hotter in comparison to the iPhone, the great news is that neither device overheated. Last year, I had to stop and start so many times when doing similar tests with the Pixel 5, so this improved performance from Google is greatly appreciated. But aside from 2 to 3 instances, in regards to general video and audio quality, once again, the iPhone 13 Pro is the ultimate winner. And if video quality is your number one priority when choosing between these two phones, the iPhone 13 Pro is the way to go. But then we come to photography, and this is where Google normally does their best work. So perhaps they might be able to level things out a little more. We'll start by looking at a range of daytime photos. And the first thing I notice is how the script seems to flip a bit in regards to dynamic range. Now it's the iPhone that tends to crush the darker parts of its images, and in some cases, it also struggles to retain the highlights as well. I should mention all of these photos were taken using the standard image profile on the iPhone 13 Pro, which means no changes applied. But regardless, we're definitely seeing a lot more detail in both the shadows and highlights with images taken on the Pixel, which is really impressive. Look at this shot of me sitting on a park bench. Not only do I, the subject, look much sharper with the image taken on the 6 Pro, but take a look at that sky and that house in the background. They're pretty much completely blown out on the iPhone 13 Pro, whereas most of that detail has been retained on the Pixel phone. Aside from that, color reproduction is a lot closer this time around, though I will say the iPhone still leans ever so slightly towards more warmer tones. And in terms of sharpness, if you're shooting with either of the main or telephoto lenses, the Pixel 6 Pro's images are consistently sharper. For example, if you compare these extreme telephoto shots, the iPhone's image looks fairly mushy and unpleasing, whereas the Pixel's image still looks quite sharp and usable in comparison. The big benefit of the iPhone 13 though is the performance of the ultra-wide lens. Whilst it's still not as good as the Pixel in terms of dynamic range, the field of view is much wider, it's also quite a bit sharper, and it suffers less from that purple fringing issue that we often see in the Pixel's ultra-wide images. But then if we take a look at portrait photos, things get even more interesting. This used to be an area that Google smashed out of the park in my subjective opinion, but this year it's like their impressive software processing just can't keep up with those upgraded sensors. And so as a result, edge detection is not nearly as reliable as the iPhone 13 Pros. And in fact, I'd say at least 50% of the time, it's actually pretty woeful, meaning despite the better dynamic range and the fact that I just subjectively prefer the general color and lighting of Google's portrait images, the edge detection is just too inconsistent and doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence. Selfie portraits though are much more equitable in regards to edge detection. In fact, I mostly prefer the results from the Pixel 6 Pro thanks to, like I said, the much better performance in dynamic range, and the fact that we can punch out to that 0.7 wider field of view is really handy. That was a feature we last saw on the Pixel 3 devices, so I'm super stoked Google brought it back for the 6 Pro this year. As for nighttime photography, it's the same story here as per usual. The Pixel's photos are often much brighter than those taken on the iPhone 13 Pro. However, image clarity and sharpness does take a hit as a result. There's also quite a bit more noise evident in the Pixel's night sight shots, whereas the iPhone 13 Pro is able to keep noise to a minimum thanks to pretty much crushing any darker areas of their images. And it's even worse when switching to the ultra wide and telephoto lenses, where image clarity on the Pixel 6 Pro takes a serious hit. So whilst the Pixel 6 Pro might have a little more of that shock and awe factor in regards to the results it can produce in low light scenarios, the photos are actually not nearly as reliably usable as those taken on the iPhone 13 Pro. We do still have night sight portrait images on the Pixel 6 Pro, which in some fringe scenarios does yield better results. But for the most part, even without this feature, the iPhone 13 Pro was still able to take some pretty impressive low light portrait shots. And whilst Google does have its astrophotography mode, which allows the phone to capture long exposure images whenever it detects you're using a tripod, whilst the results can be super impressive, they take such a long time to capture that I'm not ever that keen to actually utilize the feature. And for some reason, it currently doesn't work when you switch over to the ultra wide lens, which is seriously disappointing. I don't know if that's a bug or what, because it did work with the ultra wide lens on last year's Pixel 5, but that was a pretty big letdown for me. So that's all of the relatively standard photo features out of the way, but both devices do have some additional tricks up their sleeves. With the iPhone 13 Pro, it's that macro functionality, and you can see in these side-by-sides just how much closer the iPhone is able to get in comparison to the Pixel 6 Pro. Now you can switch over to the 4x telephoto lens to get a bit closer on the Pixel 6 Pro, but you can also do the same with the 3x lens on the iPhone 13 Pro, and it also gets even closer than the Pixel. On the other hand, the Pixel has this new motion toggle, which can emulate some cool shutter speed tricks normally only possible with a high-end DSLR or mirrorless camera. Firstly, there's Action Pan, and this will take an object that is moving, analyze the background around it, and add in a whole heap of fake motion blur to give the appearance of that object moving really fast in the frame. And I've got to say, these images look awesome. And then we have the long exposure mode, which will essentially emulate what happens when you set your shutter speed to a really slow setting, thereby meaning anything that's moving within the frame will become super blurry. This is probably better for nighttime shots, for capturing the lights of cars as they drive along a busy road, for example, but you can see the effect still works pretty well in the day as well. And then finally, we have Magic Eraser. This is purely a software feature that comes into play after you've taken a photo, but it's where you can essentially ask Google to remove any photo bombers or unwanted objects in your images. Depending on the photo, this feature can sometimes actually work wonders, and this is definitely one of those jaw-dropping features that impresses just about anyone watching it in real time. You can of course achieve a similar and perhaps more reliable effect through the use of software on your computer, but for a lot of people, having this function built right into the phone is super handy and impressive. And so where does that leave us? Well, as I mentioned, if video quality is your number one priority, then it's an easy decision. Hands down, the iPhone 13 Pro is the better choice over the Pixel 6 Pro in regards to capturing videos, though the gap is a little tighter this year compared to previous years. Photography though is a little more complicated. On the one hand, the Pixel 6 Pro takes, for the most part, better images in optimal lighting conditions with better performance in regards to sharpness and dynamic range. It also has much better telephoto and digital zoom shots thanks to the fact that it has that 4x lens and slightly better post-processing compared to the iPhone 13 Pro. The iPhone though has a better ultra-wide lens with a much wider field of view, and I'd say nighttime shots are also more reliable than those captured with the Pixel, though that's probably debatable. With that said, after using both of these phones as my main devices for an extended period of time, here are my final thoughts. If you're looking for a super reliable camera system that will capture quality photos and videos in pretty much every scenario, then the iPhone 13 Pro is the way to go. But if you're interested in a camera system that is perhaps a little more fun and that can often wow you with some of its results, but also sometimes underwhelm you with others, then the Pixel 6 Pro is the one to go for. Year on year, Google keeps adding features to its camera system that leaves more jaws dropped than any other camera system on the market. Features like Magic Eraser and Action Pan, these are like wow features that really impress anyone I show them to. On the iPhone, the only time that's maybe ever happened is when I'm showing videos captured in cinematic mode, but aside from that, no one I know has ever really been that wowed or impressed by the images and videos it captures. But personally, as fun as it is to wow people, after a while, all I want is a reliable camera system that I'm confident will get the shot or video I'm wanting. I'm actually not an iPhone user except for when I'm reviewing these phones, and so I actually won't get to enjoy the reliable camera system of the 13 Pro long term, but hopefully that insight will help you if cameras are a deciding factor. But that, my friends, is all she wrote. Let me know your thoughts on these two phones and their camera systems down in the comments. And don't forget to check out all of the incredible Rhino Shield Black Friday promotions using the first link down in the description below, and use the code SAMPRO at checkout to get an additional 10% off your order. If you enjoyed the video, it has been a massive effort to put together, so a sub would be incredible. But aside from that, thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.